Hi, I'm Linda Olson with the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I have been doing domestic violence work for over 30 years, and I've been at the coalition for about 10, working on their housing programs. And I am really delighted to be here to do this training for the Department of Commerce and all of the housing homeless providers throughout Washington State to get a better understanding of domestic violence survivors, the dynamics, as well as safety planning. All of these are requirements for your COC contracts, your CHG contracts, all of those alphabet soup kind of contracts that are so important for your housing work and for domestic violence providers and survivors. We are, in particular, really happy that there will be an expanded knowledge for all of you. This training is tailored for you. It is taking into consideration that you don't just see survivors of domestic violence, but you also see those who have caused harm. You see entire families. You see the impacts. They are often together. And it's important that you understand how to work with everybody because no one wants any of them to be homeless. So the relationship is the intervention, and this is about building those relationships so you all can do an amazing intervention with survivors. The outline for this training is really divided into two segments. The first is dealing with domestic violence and homelessness. You're all probably aware at some level that domestic violence is really prevalent in terms of homeless survivors, homeless people. Recognizing and responding to domestic violence is a part of the first segment. The second segment will include the safety planning. And then the final segment will talk about working with domestic violence agencies and advocates so that you have a partnership. You can't do it all. You're not expected to do it all. But you still need to be able to be on the front line for so many people. So how does domestic violence lead to homelessness? At about this time, I would be asking people if they've worked with DV survivors, and every time I've done that, just about every hand goes up in the room. And it's evident, I think, for most of us to say that DV is a leading cause of homelessness for women and children, many families in the U.S. All of the data that we see, there are a variety of data points that goes anywhere from 30% to 80% of people, women and children who are homeless because of domestic violence. Survivors often have to leave their homes to flee from domestic violence because they're in danger. They're in a lethal situation and have to get out immediately. Sometimes even when the person who is causing harm leaves, whether it's because of a protection order excluding him or them from the household, or whether they willfully leave the home, the survivor might not be able to afford to stay there. Sometimes they are evicted due to the abuser's behavior. Oftentimes there are many calls to a home because of the domestic violence and the abuse. And even though it's technically illegal to evict a survivor of domestic violence based on the domestic violence, because of the nuisance in the apartment or in the neighborhood or in the facility, that can frequently happen. DV interferes with the ability to access housing. Those who have experienced domestic violence, again, often have bad credit. They don't have access to their safety needs through housing. They have very poor rental histories, if any sort of history at all. So the background and what they're trying to do to get into housing is prohibitive at many times. And abusers often will sabotage a survivor's economic stability. They might have trouble paying deposit, rent, and utilities, and often this is because they have no money, everything is drained, and there could be stalking by that abusive partner to prohibit any sort of landlord or dissuade an employer from providing any sort of stability to a survivor's life. Another thing that really impacts the whole homelessness issue for survivors, and this is something that you're all very familiar with, and that is the impacts of trauma. We know that when people are homeless, all of the different reasons that they are homeless, with family violence often being a huge reason, it's just that history of trauma, the trauma impacts, and how those symptoms play out. It can severely disrupt survivors' lives and is often a significant contributing factor to chronic homelessness in women. We've seen a number of studies where women, single women, chronically homeless women in shelter programs are asked about domestic violence, and you can see time and time again that that has been a part of their experience, often going back to childhood domestic violence, child abuse, sexual violence. Survivors who can't retain their housing are highly vulnerable to re-abuse. We're aware of that again when they are on the streets and they are vulnerable and often seek the safety of perhaps a new partner and then become the victim of survival sex and other coercive control. Survivors may also engage in illegal activity in order to survive, leading to a criminal history record. We have heard from many, many survivors that that is one of their biggest barriers, is that they do have a criminal history record because of working in the sex industry, because of drugs and alcohol, sometimes because they themselves have perpetrated abuse against other people. And probably the biggest thing that is so hurtful and harmful in the long term is that survivors frequently become disconnected from their social support network. Social support networks are vital. Connection is vital for every human being. And when someone is disconnected from that on an ongoing long-term basis, it perpetuates the trauma and perpetuates that lack of groundedness and having a space to heal from the trauma so that there is some stability as they seek housing. Don't forget the kids. That's a really important part of the domestic violence and families and how that impacts and the cycle of violence that too many times goes through to the kids and is repeated often by children in their future relationships. More than half of DV survivors live in households with children under 12. 47% of homeless school-age children and 29% of homeless children under 5 have witnessed domestic violence in their families. One of the things that has often been heartbreaking for me is when I listen to survivors and how they talk about the violence that their children have witnessed, very often thinking that they really weren't there, but only come to find out later that they heard everything. They were there under the table, in a closet, and it impacts, long-term impacts. Exposure to this violence significantly impacts development, behavior, education, health, mental health, and increased risk-taking behaviors as adolescents and adults. Another important dynamic in terms of domestic violence, sexual violence, and homelessness is with the LGBT population. The most frequently cited factor contributing to LGBT homelessness was family rejection based on sexual orientation and gender identity, with the second most common reason of being forced out by their parents after coming out. This is the emotional abuse, sometimes it's physical abuse, but it continues to exacerbate and contribute to the trauma and makes it very difficult for any sort of stability for LGBT youth and ultimately adults. Once homeless, LGBT youth are more likely to endure discrimination and harassment that extends their homelessness, plunging them into a cycle of physical and sexual exploitation. Housing instability may also force them into survival behaviors that jeopardize their well-being and their safety. Between 20 and 40% of homeless youth identify as LGBT. LGBT youth are also disproportionately likely to remain homeless due to overt discrimination when seeking alternative housing. This data is, in addition to the Williams Institute UCLA School of Law, is also from the HUD Exchange, and it's data that's expanding. We don't know a lot about adult survivors of violence as it connects with their sexual orientation and gender identity. So recognizing and responding to domestic violence. And what we would say, first of all, is have the conversation. So many of us hesitate to ask the question, have the conversation, follow through on our instincts or things that might reveal there's possibly domestic violence because we don't quite know what to do or say if somebody says, yes, there is. So the first thing is just to go back in terms of the primary dynamic. And I know many of you, maybe most of you, have received some sort of basic DV 101 training and seen the power and control wheel. So in thinking about that power and control wheel, it's important to remember that domestic violence is a pattern of power and coercive control. Again, it's a pattern, it's not just one instance, but that pattern is used by one person over another person, including more behaviors than just physical or sexual abuse, with the consequence or harm experienced by the person who resists. So when somebody decides, whether through emotional abuse, verbal abuse, physical abuse, to try and retain, maintain, exert power over another human being, there is that dynamic of coercive control that often the person being controlled might resist, might be a little unhappy about. So there's potentially that pushback and a sense of trying to regain autonomy. So when you look at the power and control wheel and that pattern, there is usually somebody who is primarily in power and will do everything they can to maintain that power. And often somebody who is saying, this isn't okay with me. I want my autonomy, I want my independence, I don't want to be treated like this. So there can be that cycle, that pushback. So when a survivor's autonomy and safety is influenced by their experience and knowledge of the person causing harm, it helps instruct us in terms of the planning and choices that they have to anticipate related to that abusive partner's reaction and potential actions. So in that cycle, in that sense of trying to regain some freedom, somebody is really thinking through what's happening, the experience, how can they apply that to the next situation. And it's a constant work in progress when you're with somebody who's surviving DV. A survivor's community becomes smaller. One of the ways of manipulating, one of the ways of controlling is to completely isolate. And that's probably the worst part, sometimes even worse than the physical bruises, the emotional exploitation and exertion of not having connection with anybody. As I've already said, connection is really important for human beings. So when that is taken away, when autonomy is destroyed in a way that somebody can't see their family or connect with their friends, or that they're so isolated, they're not allowed to use the phone, it really undermines their options. They feel like they don't have options. Okay. So there are 9 things to know about domestic violence, sexual violence. The first thing is the one that I've been saying the most about already, is that coercion and abuse is about power and control. And these catchy little circles are out there and developed by my colleagues Lee Hofheimer and Eileen Stoll in a way that they might be easier to remember. So the biggest circle is about coercion and about power and control. And remembering that it is purposeful and intentional. And in the midst of that, sometimes it's difficult to figure out who is causing harm and who is the target of harm. Again, going back to that pattern of somebody saying, I don't like being controlled, I don't like being hit, hurt, humiliated in public. So, you know, the little pushbacks and getbacks. And then ultimately the fundamental harm of abuse is a loss of autonomy. And one of the things that, again, I know you get your trauma training, that's part of this work that you're all doing. And one of the big components of healing from trauma is to regain autonomy, to get that sense of self back, and that space to be able to make your own decisions. It's also important to remember, and probably the next big thing, is that survivors are the experts. It's very easy for any of us to step outside and take a look at what we hear is going on and say, well, you know, it's clearly dangerous. Why don't they get out? This is ridiculous. If I were you, I would do this, that, and the other thing. But we really don't know. We don't know that whole bit of history and of abuse. And we need to really listen to the survivors when we're asking them about domestic violence, asking them about their experiences, because they are the experts in their life. And there are so many things they're not going to share with you, share with us. Why would they, for heaven's sakes? This is really personal. So trusting that they know their lives. And even if they are weighing risks and trying to determine what would be the best route to go, even if you think you're offering a better option or seeing another way, you still aren't sure. It's important to remember that abusers, this person in a survivor's life, will only use the amount of force necessary. And by that it means maybe there was some major sort of beating or battering or harm or threat to kill a family member. And then all it takes after that is just a very little hint. It might be a pinch, it might be a look, it might be just a shove or a word, a key comment that would reduce that survivor to this sense of fear, knowing that there could be more physical harm coming later, or there's another shoe that's going to drop. So sometimes when you're listening to a survivor story and there is a comment about, you know, this happened, I was pinched, or they were playing and he put my head underwater, and you might say, well, that's not a big thing. And actually it is often indicative of another abusive incident that brings back all of those memories and those fears. So if we were to say, and the point coming back to you, well, is that all? You know, even that sense of not saying the words but responding in a way that would show that didn't seem like a big deal, it gives the abusive person more power in that survivor's life because you're not believing them. You're hearing what for them is really frightening and not realizing that there's a whole backstory and dismissing that. Past abuse matters. It impacts the current decision-making of the survivor. So always keep in mind that you are not looking at just one incident, one particular occasion in an individual's life, that there's often a history of abuse not just with that particular perpetrator, that person causing harm, but it could be back through other relationships. It could go back through childhood. I have heard from survivors who come to shelter and are not, you know, really saying a lot about their abuse from this current partner, and their comments are, you should see what my father did to me. And so there's that whole history of abuse and the trauma that is triggered by that abuse, and that sense of perhaps this person is much more of a protective factor than another person who caused harm in their life. Forced sex is something, again, a lot of people are not going to be able to talk about, want to talk about. It might be the only abuse that they experience, but still it is devastating, it's humiliating. There are many survivors who will recount how after a beating, they are forced to have sex in order to make up. So just being aware and mindful that this is an underlying sort of current in the experience and lives of so many survivors. Not telling is not the same as lying. I know so many of us, as we're interviewing or talking to an individual and we hear different stories, and somebody discloses this at one time with one person and then denies it somewhere else. It's just that matter of trying to discern who is it safe to share this with. Who do I really want to talk to about this? And what's the benefit of telling you? What do I have to gain if I share this really deeply personal thing? I mean, I don't know about you, but there are a lot of things that have happened in my life that there's no way I would share with another human being. So just being mindful of how difficult these conversations can be. Survivors have been surviving before we met them, after they leave us. One of the things we tell advocates frequently is, you know, you feel like you have to save every life, and if you're not there for that phone call or that particular question, everybody's going to die. They're going to die. And we get really caught up in the frenzy and the frantic feelings. And the reminder is survivors have been surviving. They will continue to survive. They are some of the most resilient people you will ever see, find. You might be one of those incredibly resilient people. So you know just the fact that people do survive. They figure out a way to live from one day to another. And you are one more step along the way in their journey. The best way to support children is to support parents. This can be really challenging when you feel that a child is witnessing abuse, that a child is not being well taken care of by a parent, that there might be so much going on in the life of these people that the child would be better off in a safer place with somebody else. Not true. Children are traumatized when they're removed from a parent. And so the best way to support children, to support resilience in children, is to support the parent and child together and to see them as linked, to see how important it is to have a healthy parent who can support and love and be present for the child. And the best thing you can do is work with that parent in a way that they have the space to heal from trauma, and so they can be more attentive and be more clearly loving and available to their kids. And that's something you can help with rather than thinking about replacing them in that child's life. This is a big one. The big question of leaving doesn't equal safety. We all hear it. I hear it all the time. For years, all 34 years of working in this, why doesn't she, they, he? Why don't they just go? Why don't they just leave? It's clearly an abusive relationship. Get out. Don't be silly. Well, I think it's important, again, to remember many of the headlines, the news headlines. We know that the most dangerous time for a survivor is when they decide to separate or to leave a relationship. If you read your news stories really closely, you can see chances are when there's been a homicide, when there's been a really severe beating, the separation had happened. Somebody had decided to go. And the franticness of person who is causing harm, person who is maintaining control, the idea of losing this individual in their life. There's that desperate sense of, I need to stop that. And sometimes there is that homicide-suicide, that whole idea, if I can't have you, nobody else can, and we're all just going to go out together. So whatever you do, no matter how evident it might seem to you that the best thing to do is leave, and I've certainly been there, we all have, keep in mind that what that abuser might do when that departure is final or on the way can be much more severe than for a survivor staying in that relationship. So now that you've got a sense or have seen these basic dynamics boiled down into our neat little circles, how do you ask about abuse? This can be such an awkward question, and I realize that people come to you in many different ways, whether it is coordinated entry, maybe it's a 211 call, maybe it is an intake, somebody's been referred to you from coordinated entry. So what is the process of having that conversation? The question in some way is on most of your forms. It certainly is a part of the SBDAT or many of the other assessment tools that are out there. Not particularly asked well at all, but being able to think about the first thing you need to do is establish rapport and foster trust. This isn't something that in the middle of a questionnaire or on an intake packet you drop it off so that you can check the box or whatever. this is a whole process that requires some time if you really want good information. If you really want to let that person know that you care, that you will guard their information, and will treat it gently and kindly and compassionately. So rapport, fostering trust, first step. It will probably take longer than your little assessment VI Espadat tool. So just keep that in mind as you're working your way through whatever assessment you have to use. If you have two people together in a couple, interview individuals separately. That is best practice, even if they show up as a couple, just to do that consistently, and not because you suspect there might be domestic violence with that particular couple, but just make it standard. You interview them at least for the first time separately. If they are a family unit and it's important to have follow-up conversations with them as a couple together, that's one thing, but establish that personal relationship. I'm aware in terms of cultural sensitivity and just the way so many relationships are looked at in different cultures and religion, that often there is somebody who is the spokesperson for the family. And it's important to be sensitive to that and assure folks that you're not trying to usurp that, if that is a dynamic that you're sensing, that it's just standard to get a personal sense of each individual. Be mindful of safety dynamics from beginning to end. When someone walks through your door, what's happening? Is there that sense of body language, of any sort of unease or fearfulness? I know you've got great intuitive factors, so be mindful. Also be mindful of culture and language. When you're talking about abuse, domestic violence, there might not be words in somebody's language for domestic violence. It might be acceptable practice for certain forms of what we would call abuse to be a part of that culture. So just being thoughtful about what is happening for them and how you can be respectful while still finding out more about that relationship, how they are being treated, or how someone coming into you individually is being treated in a separate relationship. Ask if they've recently been physically hurt by someone. And there are many different ways of doing this, but just getting a sense of, have you been hurt? Are you afraid of someone? Is there somebody in your recent past that you are trying to avoid, don't want to have any part of? Is there anything that might have been physically abusive? And just ask those questions in a variety of different ways. And it's amazing the types of information you can get back. Give examples of abuse. A lot of people don't realize that maybe that really hard push is abusive. Maybe it's important to give an example of verbal abuse, of treating somebody in a way that's very humiliating. So different examples of what that looks like. And then if there is someone that they are afraid of, is that person nearby? Is that person, a far ways away? Is that somebody that we all need to be aware of? If it sounds like there has been domestic violence after you've gone through this conversation, ask very thoughtfully and sensitively if they would like to speak to a DV advocate. They might not. It might be a welcome opportunity, and then be able to connect them with one if that is something that they say that sounds like a good idea. As you're interviewing people, and as you're thinking about the person who is being caused harm, it's important to keep in mind the level of contact the victim, the survivor, the person being harmed needs to have with the person who's harming them. The survivor may not have any choice. There might be a whole variety of reasons why, even though there might be a separation in the relationship, that survivor might have left, might have just said, I don't want to have any part of the relationship, this person anymore. But there are other factors such as child visitation. Court-ordered visitation might be a reason why a survivor would be connecting with someone who has been abusive. Often a survivor, rather than doing one of those quick trade-off spots, might feel like they're safer, the child is safer, if they're close, if they're not too far away. So considering that this is a key point for connection with someone who has caused harm, sometimes that individual causing harm is the primary child care provider. It is not uncommon for a survivor of domestic violence to actually have the job or be out looking for work or needing to be out and about, and their partner becomes that child care provider. Transportation. There are many survivors isolated in a way that they can't drive, they don't know the bus system, they're really reliant on an abusive partner in order to get out and about, to see family, friends, to get to appointments. Access to money. Sometimes that individual has access to money that they wouldn't have otherwise. Health care or disability needs. There are a fair number of people who are abusive who are also the care provider for someone who has a disability, someone who needs that sort of support, and they rely on that individual to be the person who picks up their check or pushes their wheelchair or helps them with therapy. Uncertain legal status. This is huge, especially right now in this current climate, is the suspicion or the concern that they will somehow be deported. Even if they're here legally, even if they have a green card, legal status might be used against them. And so there is that constant fear that that would be used against them. So they will stay in relationships because of that. And then, of course, facing homelessness. For so many, the absolute worst thing that could happen, especially if there's children, would be homelessness and having their kids on the street. Sometimes the survivor wants contact, and it's helpful to be aware of that dynamic also. We all hope for change. When we fall in love with somebody, we generally have wonderful things that we like about this person. It often is very fun at the beginning, and generally that whole dynamic of abuse happens over time. And so the hope for change, that if we go back to this particular point in our lives, everything will be fine again. If they can only do this or get that diploma or get that particular thing, that job, everything will be fine. Oftentimes they want the relationship. Connection, connection, connection. We talk about that constantly. And having a relationship, even if it's a bad one, might be much better than having none at all. Maybe it's the parent of the child. I've heard many survivors basically say, we are going to stay together and that person is going to be a parent. He's going to be a father, she's going to be a mother. I don't care. We are doing this together, and that's that. Emotional support. Again, having somebody there when you need them. And sometimes this is a bit of that coercive control, because someone can step in with emotional support when someone is hurting and is needy, and it enables or just fosters that connection even more and can be used as a manipulative tool, and that survivor is going to say, I have to have this. This is the person who understands what I went through in that particular situation, and only they understand that, and I need to have them around for this. Healthcare, disability needs, that could be a reason why they want contact, or having a home could be a reason for contact. One of the biggest questions I get anymore, many of us get, is, well, when both people are engaged in physical violence, they are both perpetrators. I can't tell the difference. Who's the victim? Who's the perpetrator? Who's the survivor? Who's the abuser? I can't tell. Do we just get rid of everybody? And, again, that is something that takes patience and teasing out. And we certainly want to be able to work with both members of a couple, whether they are together in your unit or whether they are a romantic partnership in a facility or often rapid rehousing units. it's important to try and figure out how they can stay housed and how do you work with this dynamic. You can't rely on gender or a list of behaviors to determine who the survivor is. You have to consider, first of all, the context. In our criminal legal system, when somebody is arrested, it is based on that one particular incident, that there was physical violence, this person is the perpetrator, that person is the victim, and there is this desire to make it very clear in terms of who victim and perpetrator are. Often in DV programs, we also have to be able to identify who the victim is, because part of our funding stream comes to us because we're serving victims, and that's a requirement. But that's not the requirement that you all have. You need to look at the context and not be so caught up with who's the victim and who's the perpetrator, but rather look at this very complicated relationship and the context. What has been happening? What has been the patterns of coercive control, of power and control? What are they doing together with one another? What's happening? Think about the intent. Is this particular instance of violence that you might be witnessing, is it intended to exert power? Is it intended to put somebody under their thumb or to make them feel less than, or to make sure they know who is boss? Or is it actually an attempt to get out of that oppressive place of being hurt by somebody? And what's the effect? Is one person going to really pay for whatever it is they're doing? Maybe you've identified a person that I might call the survivor as the one who actually perpetrated violence. They were the one who hit or did something physical. What is the response that they're ultimately going to get? What will be the effect? How much are they going to pay for that down the road? And being able to discern that. Or is it a matter of somebody who has physically hurt somebody and the person who was hurt is never, ever, ever going to respond to that? They are going to pay dearly by that physical act of violence. Who has the biggest consequences? Who will be retaliated against for resisting? That's another way to ask that question. And so when you're looking at people in this situation, it's great to explore other strategies besides eviction. Now I realize when you are in an apartment complex or when you've got a landlord in rapid rehousing that is just really frustrated because this couple, these people are just not getting along, it's loud, noisy, police are being called. If that individual who has been who is being harmed, indicates that they want to be safe, that they need safe housing, you do need to be able to provide, if you are HUD funded, an emergency transfer for them. Of course, the question often is, where would they go? We don't have other units available. This is not necessarily easy to do, but it's something that needs to be explored for the sake of safety. Otherwise, there's a lot of need for creativity. When two people continue to be in close proximity to one another, whether it is an apartment facility that you are managing, or whether it is within a unit that there is no safe place for that individual to go in permanent housing. Sometimes there is the potential to provide housing for the person who has caused harm. And I've heard some lovely stories about programs that were actually able to identify a housing voucher that one or the other of them could take someplace else and leave the unit with the one member of the couple. So being creative, what are the different things that can happen besides eviction? Listen differently and build bridges. I think the whole theme for this training is to listen very differently from what you might ordinarily listen to, with the idea of building bridges. Listen to that survivor and ask what they need and what they want. If the person causing harm is present with the survivor, do not have a decision-making or a safety-related conversation. Consider why a survivor may use violence: in self-defense, to protect their children, or to regain control over their life. It's messy, relationships are complicated, and it takes time and it takes patience. Help bridge the relationship between the survivor and the DV program, because you don't have to do it all. It isn't just all on your shoulders. I think that every single one of you who would be participating in this training are amazing, wonderful people who just do great work. And being able to take care of yourself and utilize your team as well as partnerships with DV programs is the way that's going to help you with your long-lasting work. Confidentiality is key. Honor it no matter what. Survivors' control over their information is a key part of their autonomy and safety. We've talked a lot about how important autonomy is, restoring that so that someone can heal from trauma. And having control over their information, knowing and understanding who knows what about them, having the right to say, no, I don't want you to share that with that person or in that system. Legal protections are in place at state and federal levels for many of these instances, and it's good to keep that in mind. There will be a little bit more later about some of those protections as we work with domestic violence agencies. And it's important to look for potential breaches of confidentiality in your program. And by breach, it's sometimes that sloppiness of who we're talking to, what information we're sharing, certainly not in the lunchroom. Are we using people's names out in public, and maybe we shouldn't be? It's just really being careful about how we regard somebody and how we're talking about them, how we're talking to them, and who's around when we're doing that. Where is our paper shuffling going? Who knows what? And how can people be aware and mindful that you respect who they are? And when in doubt, ask the survivor. If there's something you're not sure of, find out what it is they'd like. Find out who they want you to talk to or not. And please don't be upset if they say, it matters to me that you're not sharing information, even if you think this program is really valuable for that individual. Welcome back. This is segment 2 of the work that we're doing together, and this is on safety planning. Many of you may be familiar with safety planning, and this really digs into a lot of the details, and it's almost like a harm reduction for safety planning for survivors. This particular segment is built on the work of Jill Davies and Eleanor Lyon. This is an amazing book that I would recommend that you read if you wanted to find out more. It's called Domestic Violence Advocacy 2, Complex Lives and Difficult Choices. And this particular book, and as we've adapted it here for you all, really goes through the challenges of identifying with a survivor, what it means to be safe, what it means to try and reduce harm in their lives. So ultimately, the goal is to be safer. Ideally, we would say safety should be complete, no violence at all. Isn't that a vision that we all want for our lives, for the lives of everybody? What we might have to be looking at instead in the other column on a slide is safer, and that might be less violence. That might be a reduced level of violence. It might be less frequent. It might be less control in terms of the relationship. We also want basic human needs met, something that we would want for our survivors as well as for ourselves. But we might have to look at economic stability increased, fewer gaps in meeting basic needs, and more financial resources. And if you, as a case manager, can support a survivor in increasing economic stability, that gives them more choices, that gives them options that are real. It might be a stepping stone to actually launching out and being able to be separate and independent from the person causing harm. But you start with increasing that economic stability. Same thing with social and emotional well-being. We all want to be safe, healthy, well, and we might have to settle for their well-being strengthened. And that, again, is something that if we can, as case managers, think about the more resilience to the effects of violence, helping survivors with emotional healing, increasing their social supports. That is so critical, their connection, the people that they turn to, reinforcing their cultural strengths. If we can play a factor in the work that they're doing there, that again provides more options for them. And it gives them a real choice in terms of perhaps considering more seriously ending a relationship. One of the things that Jill Davies and Eleanor Lyons does is think about a risk analysis. When you're thinking about safety planning, you have to think about the risks on both sides. The risks that someone is facing with an abusive partner, or the risks that someone is looking at in life. So what would life be like without that abusive partner? Okay, maybe there's no violence, maybe you're not being hit or hurt, but then what's out in the neighborhood? What would that be like? How terrifying could that be? What is it like for the children? All right, so they might be witnessing violence. Maybe they experience some violence. But then what would life be like for them if they were out in the neighborhood, if they were on the streets? What is the alternative? Could you make ends meet in a way that the kids could be supported? Who handles the money? Do you have access to a car? These are things that is a part of the consideration of staying with an abusive partner, even though they're very abusive. Is your name on the lease? Maybe it isn't. Maybe you are so reliant, that survivor is so reliant on that particular partner. Does that partner know how to use the systems against you? And that is huge. It's one of the things we hear about constantly in terms of the use of the legal system. Maybe it's the child welfare system, maybe it's just the system of protection orders, the civil legal things that survivors might be looking at in terms of custody and divorce. Someone who is an abusive partner often has those systems down and can use every single one of them in a devastating way against an individual, so that we hear stories of the abuse dragging on and on and on for years, and often hear from that survivor, I should have just stayed. This is too painful, it's too much, it's too wearing. Sometimes an abusive partner is a source for drugs, and this can be another way for that dependency to realize itself, and the difficulty in leaving of what would be the alternative if I am addicted? What would be the alternative if I'm simply not able to think about treatment or any other alternatives? If I absolutely have that fix, where else would I get it from? So out in the community, when you're making those choices, when a survivor is looking at the community, and what would they have in terms of transportation? You know, this is something that you could potentially help with as you're doing that safety planning. Here are transportation resources. Here are the ways to use those buses. Here are the different things that you can do to potentially learn how to drive a car. Do you have access to health care insurance? That could be something that could be the reassurance that gives somebody the freedom to perhaps move out from that relationship. What about safe, affordable housing? We know that there are so many survivors that do not leave violent relationships because of housing. They don't have a place to go. And while many will go to an emergency shelter just for the immediate safety, the longer term needs of a permanent place to be is so critical. And again, they will consider going back to that secure place, if there was one, rather than being out on the streets, not knowing where they'll be, not knowing what will happen after emergency shelter. Sometimes it's safer for them to return. Are there supports in the community? When you think about the isolation that often happens with domestic violence, being able to connect with a survivor while you're doing some of the safety and the risk analysis of where are their supports, where are your friends, who are your family members, are you able to reconnect with them? What would that look like? Are they folks that unfortunately aren't, the healthiest folks in the world? But maybe you can connect with them here and there in a way that can sustain you, that you know that you have friends and loved ones who care about you. What makes children safer? This is something we all like to think about. It's important to hold up high because of the intergenerational cycle of violence that we often want to stop, hopefully, and hopefully that can happen in the housing that's provided. But what makes children safer? Violence prevention and reduction. Being able to prevent the violence and even reducing it. Economic stability and educational opportunity. The idea of being able to sustain, support a survivor or a family unit. Maybe it's both the person causing harm and the person who is being harmed. How can their economic stability be improved? How can educational opportunity be available for the children in an environment that is less violent and a place where a child can at least study and feel safe? Well-being strengthened, that is so critical again for healing the trauma that might have existed, that could have been happening over the years as a part of this relationship. Capable caretakers are what make children safer. Having a parent survivor safer and supported, and a parent doing harm less harmful and more helpful. When you're actually doing safety planning, it's a process, it's not a product. If you've seen or worked with those 3 or 4 page safety planning guide lists or checklists, please don't pay any attention to it. It was a nice little tool that many DV advocates used to help people when they were trying to decide whether to leave, what they needed to leave. It is not a one and done. Safety planning is a process, and it is something that changes often from day to day, hour to hour, situation to situation. And it's up to you just to be intuitive and understanding and get a sense of where somebody needs to be going. Initiate the conversation. If you are getting a sense that someone is going out to a critical appointment, are they going back to their original neighborhood? Are they going to go see their family and friends? Are there things that they're facing with that court appointment? What's happening that they might need some additional safety planning? If they think that somebody is stalking them, maybe that abusive partner or a new partner in their lives is always around the corner, start asking them more about that. Initiate the conversation. What's happening? Review the risks. Well, have you thought about not going to that part of town? I know that you really do want to see your family, but it sounds like that might not be the safest right now. And of course, it's their choice. It's for you just to weigh with them the options, to offer suggestions, to perhaps give them some reflections and feedback about how you might be fearful for what it is they're about to do. It's important to understand how terrifying court can be. And again, maybe offer to go with them if that's something that might be a part of your job. But reviewing the risks, what are the things that they can do to mitigate those risks? Identify relevant options and resources. All right, so there you are, and you're with your family, you're with that one person, your sister who has just not been doing well, and they have perhaps a drug dealer that they've introduced to the situation. You know it's dangerous. What are your options for getting out? What are the resources available to you? When you think that you might face somebody who has been violent to you in the past, where can you go? Where are you looking? What are your outs? And finally, at the end, when somebody has been off and about for the day or the week or whatever it is they were doing, check in with them. Find out what happened with the plan. Find out how they changed it, what worked, what didn't work, what would they do differently next time. So because this is difficult and because you're not a DV advocate, it's critical that you be aware of safety planning, but being able to be a part of your program with safer planning and thinking about your DV agency partner, you might want to be able to consult with them, identify who they are. One of the things that you could check out is the Washington State Coalition Against Domestic Violence website. We have a tab that is working with survivors, and it lists all of the DV agencies in Washington State, so you can identify who those agency partners might be. How can you build a relationship with them? You will face many complexities in relationships within your housing program, from complete separation to choosing to stay. You've got to be fast on your feet, and I really admire, again, each one of you, because that's changing. In DV world, what our tendency is we're looking at who is the survivor and how can we help keep that survivor safe. And you're looking at safety, and you're looking at the wider range of the complexity of human relationships and what they're doing together. So how can you work with that survivor along that whole continuum? Help the survivor with other safe housing resources within your program or another program when that's requested. Help the person causing harm with resources if they become homeless due to exclusion from the unit. This is a challenging dynamic for many. I've heard a number of providers say, I really don't want to help that person. They're violent, they're annoying, they've hurt people. I don't want them in our program. And I would encourage taking that breath and that pause and being able to think about each person as a human being, thinking about whatever happened to that individual, that they are so hurt, so abusive, so angry, and thinking that it's not the best thing for them or anybody else to be living under a bridge, and to try and restore a certain amount of human dignity in a way that perhaps both people can be housed in a safe way separately if that's what the dynamic calls for. And don't ever judge or restrict the level of contact they might need to have with each other. There are so many times when I've heard a survivor say, I never want to see that person again, and then 2 weeks later, guess what? And it's just a matter of that sense of connection, ambivalence. This is a person that they're familiar with, they know, they care about. Often they are wondering how are they doing, because they potentially might know the pain that might have incurred for that person and what their life had been like. So your relationship is the intervention. As a part of that relationship and as a part of the work that you're doing, I want to pause here just a moment and speak to the agency that you are with and the culture of the organization that you're with, because none of this is really possible without being in an organization that's trauma-informed, that really treasures and values you as a staff person, so that when you are hurt or triggered or overwhelmed or overloaded with all of the dynamics that you're dealing with, and not just with DV survivors and people who are causing harm, but the many different varieties of homelessness and the pain that people are experiencing, that organization provides the space, and that there is a culture that you as a team can take care of yourselves and of one another. Because when you are shut down, when you are overloaded, burnt out, when you are being triggered, perhaps by past instances in your own life, you need that respite, you need a place to go, because you can't provide good services if your brain is locked down. And it's not because you're not a wonderful case manager, advocate, human being. So with your relationship as the intervention, you have to be a healthy person. It's desirable for everybody, especially you. The first component of that relationship is building trust. We talked about building trust in an earlier segment of this training. It's so critical because you're not going to get anywhere unless you have that relationship with the individual, with the survivor, with the person causing harm. Unless you are able to speak with each of them, unless you are able to be able to affirm that you, believe it or not, respect them. And sometimes it's the dignity that is able, that provides the ability for that person to come around and to have a conversation. You need to understand the risk. You know, this is not a matter of Pollyanna and we're all having happy conversations and there are dogs and ponies and life is grand. There are risks involved. And you need to be aware of those risks even as you're building a relationship and going a little deeper into this person. Learn about external fears. What is happening for the people that you're working with and the fears that they're facing. You might not understand why that one individual is so angry, so loud, so abusive, until you get a sense of the PTSD that they might be experiencing from childhood, from a war experience, from some other homeless environment or a place that they've been that they're lashing out against. Identify opportunities to engage. The more you're able to connect and engage and do so innocently, not that scheduled appointment necessarily, but when you see somebody, connect with somebody, let them know that you care and that you see them as a human being. This particular piece, leveraging moments with the person causing harm, these are components that were actually developed for home visitors, and the idea that many home visitors are going into family units where the whole family is there, where someone who is causing harm is there, the person who is being harmed is there. A lot of these trainings were conducted in migrant Latina farm worker communities. And so the idea that somebody might be leaving an abusive relationship was a non-starter, or is a non-starter. They need that housing because it's provided by the employer, because there's a community surrounding them. So the home visitor, and in so many ways this applies to you all too, how can you leverage moments with the person causing harm? Build that rapport, establish and build that sense of connection with the individual. Identify the supports. Once you get the rapport, asking somebody where they go for their support. Who are their friends? Who are their families? Where are the places that they can go? And there are so many people who don't necessarily like to divulge that they need anybody or need someone in their life, but just offering up the suggestion that that is something that can be helpful for them when they're feeling hurt, angry, lonely, down, desperate. And then listen for shared goals. With home visitors, you look at a shared goal as being a parent for these children. That could be a shared goal in housing also. But sometimes the shared goal is, how do we maintain and retain this housing? How do we stay in this apartment unit? How do we stay in this building, in this program? How do we do this together and safely and not have the whole entire community furious with us and a landlord ready to evict us? Build awareness, both people, and do no harm. An important thing to remember with all of this bonding and all of the support building and becoming friendly is that whatever you say to the person causing harm may be used against the survivor. So as you're developing your relationship and it's respectful, make sure that there is that level of objectivity there, a certain neutrality that doesn't suggest that you're taking a side, that you understand that person so well that you realize why they might be doing or saying what they're doing with their partner or with their children. It's important to Be mindful of what you say and how you say it. Reduce isolation and build connection for the survivor. As we've spoken earlier, the more you can provide options in this way, the better a survivor is, the more they have access to resources, the better equipped they might be to make decisions that would be safer for themselves and their kids. Or conversely, you might be able to make a big difference in the life of the person causing harm, so that violence could be reduced, so that there could be better communication. Ultimately, your goal is to reduce violent and coercive behaviors. And it's important to work with the person causing harm to help mend or to build those relationships. Listen differently. See the survivor's risks from their perspective. This is just that reminder, survivor-driven. It is the survivor who knows the best about their life. So walk with them when they identify their risks. Understand that survivor's priorities, and they might not seem to be the same that you think they should be. You might feel that the most important thing for them to do is get that protection order now, so that they have a measure of safety. They might feel that the most important thing for them to do is bake brownies for their kids' PTA meeting that evening or for the class party. That might be the important thing for them. Understand that, respect that. Everybody has that human nature that's going on, and the desire to parent and being there for a dance recital or being there for something special for their children, a birthday party, might go far beyond what you would see as a critical safety measure. Check back in, reflect, reevaluate, and try again. If you mess up the first time, there's a lot of grace. You can keep right on going, try it again, and reassure the people involved, the person who's causing harm, the person who's being harmed, that you mean the best. You care about each one of them. Always check your understanding with the survivor. If you think that you have things down, make sure that you really do, because you might. It might not. It might feel so good that you are just floating along in a cloud and it's really going south. So always check with the survivor. One of the things we've mentioned already is how important it is to work with DV advocates and agencies. You can't do it all. That partnership is critical. Please do identify your local DV provider, and the list is on the WSCDF website. Check it out. Reach out if you haven't already. It's helpful to know what an advocate does. We often think of advocacy and advocates in legal terms or in policy terms, but in the world of domestic violence, we think of an advocate as someone who is supporting an individual, walking alongside of, speaking on behalf of, if that's what they would like, being present for and with. An advocate provides survivor-driven, meaning that the survivor is in charge. Our WACs actually say survivor-centered, but being sure that this isn't something that you feel is good for the survivor, so therefore it's centered on the survivor, but really the survivor's in charge. Mobile. It's important to get out and about and be with that survivor. That's what we talk about to advocates in programs, to be able to move past shifts and move past office space, to really be present with and for somebody in the community. And then trauma-informed. Every step has to be trauma-informed, sharing that sense of autonomy, sharing the decision-making, making sure that the survivor is fully part of what it is that you're doing and making the final decisions. As I've mentioned, accompanies, transports, supports in the community, and builds bridges to the community. It is through that community connection that someone does achieve that stability, that someone is able to make it, survive without us, for heaven's sakes. We ultimately, whether we're housing case managers or whether we're DV advocates, we don't want to be a part of this person's life forever. So it's important to be able to connect them to those community, not just resources, but the people, the neighborhoods, the networks. Advocates navigate complicated systems for and with a survivor. It is terrifying to go to court for the first time. It's terrifying to go to the CSO office. It's really daunting to face many of the different systems that we might take for granted, but that somebody who is not used to that or in a place of not understanding what's happening, doesn't know what to do or what to say or how to say it, being able to walk alongside somebody. And the advocates that I so appreciate the most very clearly say, as we are walking with somebody, our community members can see that that person is doing better. This comes from a rural community. From a Native community, an advocate is talking about, when I walk with the survivor, our community accepts them back. They understand that now they're doing better because I'm walking with them. So the bridge that our advocates build back into the community so that the community can engulf and enfold and strengthen and support. We walk with and we speak on behalf of survivors at their request. Our services are voluntary. This is mandated by all of our funding sources. I am aware that in HUD world, there is the very clear message that voluntary services are best practice. I also am aware that it's not required, but when you're working with that DV agency and with an advocate, we would definitely say services are voluntary, so please don't expect that somebody come to our organization if you think that there's domestic violence. We would not be happy in being a part of your mandatory services at all. So shelter, housing eligibility is not contingent upon accessing support services. This can be a challenge at times for advocates when we struggle with clean and sober housing, when we certainly want an environment that is positive for survivors and kids. But even there, we're getting better with harm reduction and being able to say that it is not necessary for you to be clean and sober to be in this particular shelter or in this particular unit. And we will work with you in a way that we can reduce the harm to yourself, to your neighbors, to your children. It's based on relationships. Our professional obligations, a little bit fancier. We use an empowerment model of advocacy. This is more nationally recognized. I have got in red, if you are seeing a slide on this, maintain confidentiality and legal privilege. So confidentiality is vital in everything we do, and the fact that advocates have legal privilege in their communication. Now this is just the community-based advocates. That does not apply to court or police advocates. But the communication that we have with survivors cannot be subpoenaed to court. Help survivors with safety planning and problem solving. It's probably one of our key roles. We are supposed to be accessible and culturally relevant. We keep accurate, hopefully, and minimal records. Our record keeping is next to nothing. We don't go into a lot of detail. All we do is basics to document that we have provided a service. We are mandated child abuse reporters, and we have to abide by ethics, policies, and contracts. This is just a little bit more on advocate confidentiality. All of the recipients of OVW and FIPSA grantees, so that's Office of Violence Against Women and Family Violence Prevention and Services Act grantees, are prohibited from disclosing personally identifying information in a shared database. That's part of the Violence Against Women Act, and HUD has integrated that also into HUD regulations. DV programs cannot disclose information without written permission. Our records are confidential. DV advocates' communication with survivors is privileged and protected. And privileged communications, this law protects advocacy information from being subpoenaed in court. Again, emphasizing that one of the things I have often tried to make the case or the point with many case managers, with people who are doing assessments, is that when you're asking about violence and you're asking about abuse and chemical dependency, substance abuse, mental health, your communication is not privileged. And so there is that unease on our part that survivors might not want to share because they don't know where it's going. It's not protected. It is not the same as if we were doing that sort of interview. So sometimes the encouragement that the DV provider be one of those assessment points could be helpful because we have a different relationship and can protect information a little bit more adequately. How to make a supported referral. There are many survivors that come to housing homeless programs and they really don't want to connect with the DV program. Maybe they've been there before. We all have our down moments, whether it's that advocate or maybe the program is struggling or having a bumpy time in their lifespan, but sometimes survivors simply do not want to connect with a DV program. So it's important just to ask if they do. Don't expect that they would want to, and support the survivor in making an informed decision by exploring all of the options. All right, so maybe that wasn't the greatest experience for you. I think I know of another program that could potentially offer a different opportunity, certainly a different person. Encourage rather than require participation in the DVSA agency. Offer to facilitate making a connection. Now, if you're just going to call on your own, the DV advocate is probably going to say we need to speak to the survivor. But if you did that together, if you made that connection, if someone is really uneasy or just feeling like they're unhappy or afraid of the response they might get, maybe there hadn't been a good response before, offer to make the connection with them. Do that call together. Check in consistently about their experience. Advocate for the survivor when needed. And yes, you can advocate for a survivor at a DV agency. Sometimes there are very persistent case managers who do, which I've always enjoyed. Be proactive and reach out to our agencies. Actively seek information and ask questions. So how to work together? You know, one of the things that we never have enough of is time. And when we talk about the resources in our community, this one in particular, it takes time to reach out to and get acquainted with and to know those resources. It takes time to have a cup of coffee with somebody and find out who they are and what it is that they do. And really just educate yourself about what is in the community. Ask them directly about domestic violence. There is no such thing as a stupid question. So feel free to get acquainted with a DV advocate or somebody who works with survivors in different ways. And be transparent, authentic, ask questions, build a relationship. There are a lot of free trainings and webinars out there. It's always available if you want to go on our website and see what sorts of trainings we have available on the website. You could certainly hop on if it's okay with your agency to do that. Understand confidentiality and information sharing constraints. Never get so buddy-buddy with somebody that you think they're going to share everything there is to know about a survivor or give you inside information. So it's important just to really value the confidentiality of the survivors that we work with together. And you can certainly ask theoretical questions, cases that are general that could apply to somebody, but please don't ask specific information or specific questions. Releases of information, we live by those. Make sure that the ROI is current. If you are going to be speaking with an agency, they will be doing the same on their end, current, time limited, and a survivor can retract it at any time. Build relationships before you need them. I think that's probably the most important closing thought is reach out today, build that relationship, have that cup of coffee, find out more about the DV agency and probably all of the resources in your community, and thinking about the agency that you're working with and the time and space provided so that you can do that. Thank you so much. If you've got questions, my information is available, and I know that you've got a DV agency nearby that could probably answer questions too. Thank you.